For the past several years, when it comes to home consoles, PlayStation has generally been my go-to, and even till this day, discounting PC gaming, it's still my primary gaming machine. This is largely because I play a lot of Japanese games, and not only are some of them exclusive to PlayStation, but even the ones that aren't exclusive may not be published for the Xbox simply because a lot of Japanese gaming companies don't bother publishing games for the Xbox platform because I guess they don't believe the demographic is made up of enough Xbox owners that they can realistically care. Now, for me, as long as I have my PS5, Nintendo Switch, and PC, I feel prepared for any Japanese games that might be released for either of those platforms, and for the most part, I'm satisfied with my experience with the PS5. But there's one major issue I have with it, and it's a problem that I've had for a long time that it's only getting worse over time, which is the fact that these systems are hard locked. If you look at the Xbox and even the Oculus Quest, while both these devices also have lockdown operating systems, they both have this thing called developer mode, which essentially allows you to do a soft sideload of those devices. I mean, with the Quest 2 in specific, I've actually been pretty impressed with some of the things you can do when you enable developer mode. And once you get into the world of side quests, there's a myriad of homebrew software and indie games that you can explore. Meanwhile, on the PlayStation side of things, the only experience that you'll get is the one that they streamline. So if you want to maximize the potential of the console beyond the standard experience that you get, you pretty much have to stay in tabs with the jailbreaking scene, which in recent years has been getting tighter and tighter, as the systems are getting harder to jailbreak. On the PS4, you still can't even install custom firmware, and even when progress is made, you may not even be able to get a first-hand experience with it, because the exploits in questions are exclusive to very specific firmware versions, and since these consoles don't allow you to go back to older firmwares, you're never going to be able to jailbreak them unless a new exploit is discovered on a later firmware, which even then, by the time the bounty is made public, the exploit might have already been patched. As someone who paid over 500 euros for my PS5, a part of me kind of dies when I realize that I bought a console that is missing features from a console released 2 generations ago. Things like listening to music CDs, backing up save files on a USB, saving media files on the device's storage, customizing your game's soundtrack with music saved on your console. I used to play SmackDown vs. Raw 2011 with characters that had custom songs that I added. Or better yet, remember when you used to install Linux on your PlayStation console? You could even do that back in the PS2 days. Although beyond limiting the potential of these consoles, the other major problem I have with PlayStation consoles having lockdown operating systems is the abusable position it puts them in. At some point in the future, physical media is going to die out. It's clearly the direction that gaming companies, and disappointingly even some gamers, want, where everything is all digital. And one of the main concerns I have is that at some point PlayStation will have full control over the pricing and distribution of their games, because as of right now, official retailers and even secondhand stores can still play a role in shifting the flow of the market. But once those retailers are eliminated from the conversation, the online PlayStation Store will essentially become a monopoly. Unlike on PC, where at least we have different game clients and the ability for game developers to host their games on their own websites, on the PlayStation platform, you have to comply with the pricing decisions and their policies, which I think is a huge problem. Aside from that, I'm also concerned with the developers' abilities to publish their games there. I mean, in recent years, it feels like PlayStation has been neglecting Japanese developers, even going as far as to shut down their Japan studio, and probably one of the more egregious actions from them, which was needlessly censoring some anime games, to the point where it's become a meme that Sony is somehow more prudish than Nintendo of all companies. This year alone, PlayStation has made announcements on the level of Apple when it comes to overpriced hardware that are hard locked to their ecosystems. Things like how their PSVR 2 doesn't work on PCs, or how their PlayStation Portal won't even allow you to connect your own Bluetooth earphones and you have to use the proprietary overpriced earphones. Although if we're comparing PlayStation with Apple, I wonder if the recent news are any indication for what we can expect in the future. You see, the EU, as cursed as they might be sometimes, when it comes to consumer protection laws, they can actually be pretty base. So they have something called the Digital Markets Act, and as Brave Browser's AI describes, a European law that aims to make the digital economy fairer and more contestable. Thanks, Brave AI. What's interesting is how they describe gatekeepers, which is essentially a cute way to describe oligopolist tech companies who abuse and dominate their respective markets. As of writing this script, the DMA has ascribed 6 different tech companies as gatekeepers, namely Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Meta, and Microsoft. And at this point in time, they've established a list of do's and don'ts, which are essentially rules that these companies have to follow that supposedly humble them down and prevent them from abusing their position of power. Now, I have no problems with any of the 6 companies picked, but at some point in time, I believe Sony should also be considered. Now, I will make it clear that compared to those companies, I don't think Sony is nearly as dangerous as them. But if you actually check the criteria for platforms described as gatekeepers, it puts PlayStation in an interesting position. A size that impacts the internal market. This is presumed to be the case if the company achieves an annual turnover in the European Economic Area equal to or above 7.5 billion euros in each of the last 3 financial years, or when its average market capitalization or equivalent fair market value amounted to at least 75 billion in the last financial year, and it provides a core platform service in at least 3 member states. Now, according to the public data out there, for the past 5-ish years, PlayStation has earned between $18 to $26 billion annually. Now, this rule specifically applies to the EU region, and I have no idea how much the EU accounts for those earnings percentage-wise, and whether or not it reaches 7.5 billions. It would also be a different story if the DMA were to count Sony as a whole and not just the PlayStation division. I'm also assuming that they're not talking about the net profit, because if that were the case, the number would be even lower and well below the minimum criteria, even if we were talking about Sony as a whole. If anyone has any concrete data on this, I would like to know how much PlayStation has earned in Europe alone in the past 3 years. Although as of market cap or net worth, we do know that Sony sits at around $105 billion as of September 2023. And I believe last year was even higher, which is important because the 75 billion euro requirement is for the last financial year, and $105 is around 98 euros. Now, because this topic is specifically about PlayStation, I'm not sure if the EU would take Sony's net worth or the market value for the PlayStation division alone, since Sony does more than just work on video games, and I don't think the PlayStation brand alone is worth 75 billion euros. I say this because if we take into consideration Sony's business in manufacturing multiple pieces of hardware, such as cameras, TVs, headphones, and other utilities, plus their involvement in media production and distribution, such as their own movie publishing division, their involvement in producing optical media, the distribution of music. Once we start taking into consideration all of this, it becomes debatable whether or not they're covered by the DMA, since it feels like this law more so exists to regulate online and digital ecosystems, something that you could argue doesn't make up for the entirety of Sony's net worth. But I feel very conflicted about this, because if the company that owns PlayStation has enough power financially to fit the description of a gatekeeper, I feel like you could make an argument that they would be able to control the market that they're a part of, especially when PlayStation is such a powerful gaming brand. But I have no idea. I'd be very curious to know how the EU perceives Sony in this regard. Based on my interpretation, it feels like Sony does fit this criteria, but I'm okay with being challenged otherwise. As for the core platform service, I'm pretty sure we can include the PlayStation Network as a whole. Now, the next criteria tackles the control of an important gateway for business users towards final consumers. This is presumed to be the case if the company operates a core platform service with more than 45 million monthly active end users established or located in the EU, and more than 10,000 yearly active business users established in the EU in the last financial year. Now, when it comes to active users, over the past couple of years, PlayStation has had roughly 100 million users. In fact, these past 3 years, it's been pretty consistently above 100 million. And assuming that at least 45 million of those users are Europeans, this would also cover the third criteria. Now, these data points refer to active PlayStation Network users worldwide. Once again, I have no clue how much does Europe cover for that amount of users, so I would be happy to hear feedback from anyone who's more knowledgeable on the data. As far as the statement of more than 10,000 yearly active business users, I can't really comment on that either. There are some other descriptions, for example, it has a significant impact on the internal market. As far as the gaming market, I would say yes. PlayStation has been responsible for negotiating exclusivity deals that has prevented many games from being released to certain platforms. In fact, they even have the power to influence buying decisions from other competitors. It was reported a while back that one of the main reasons for why Microsoft bought Bethesda Studios was because they caught wind of an ongoing deal for Starfield to be a PlayStation exclusive. Both PlayStation and Xbox play a huge role in influencing the industry. They have a lot of advertising value, many games release their trailers during PlayStation and Xbox showcases, even the way their games are built can be largely based on the hardware that they release. For example, a lot of games tend to be primarily designed to work on consoles, taking into account both its strengths and limitations, so much so that it can be reflected on the PC ports as well. For a long time, a lot of video games could play at high settings and high refresh rates on graphics cards with 8GB of VRAM. But recently, as we started seeing more next-gen exclusive games that are designed to run at systems with 16GB of unified memory, suddenly games are requiring you to have 12GB of VRAM bare minimum if you want to play at 1440p or higher in the highest graphical settings. This also affected the hard drive requirements, with more games strictly requiring you to have an SSD and not an HDD now that the consoles, especially the PS5, has some of the fastest SSDs out there. So yes, I do think PlayStation has a huge impact on the internal market. It provides a core platform service, which is an important gateway for business owners to reach end users. I think we can all agree that is the case. They have an online store where publishers can release full games and in-game content, as well as an online infrastructure to host online plays. Not sure if I need to elaborate any further. It enjoys an entrenched and durable position in its operations, or it is foreseeable that it will enjoy such a position in the near future. Yes, PlayStation is gonna be around forever. They've been around since the 90s and have only gotten more powerful and influential. Now, if PlayStation was deemed as a gatekeeper, what are the things that we could expect as far as rules to enforce? Let's start with the first. Allow end users to easily uninstall pre-installed apps or change default settings on operating systems, virtual assistants, or web browsers that steer them to the products and services of the gatekeeper, and provide choice screens for key services. Now for this, I'm actually not sure if the DMA would realistically try to enforce this. I mean, the thing about uninstalling pre-installed apps, I feel like PlayStation already follows this fairly neatly. As far as I'm aware, they don't prevent you from uninstalling any pre-installed apps unless we're talking about some of their more essential apps, such as their built-in web browser, the storefront, video player/recorder. That stuff I feel like wouldn't be targeted, since PlayStation could make a convincing argument for why they're integral apps, so I think we can somewhat ignore this. Allow end users to install third-party apps or app stores that use or interoperate with the operating system of the gatekeeper. Now we're going somewhere. This is essentially just sideloading, and I'm all for it. One concern I do have though is that I feel like less games would feel confident releasing their games without DRM, because having an open platform also means that community programs can be built, and as far as the past PlayStation consoles, there are already dumping tools available for backing up games. So maybe DRM software would increase as a result, so this wouldn't be all good news. Allow end users to unsubscribe from core platform services of the gatekeeper as easily as they subscribe to them. I don't think that's an issue with PlayStation, so we can skip this one. Allow third parties to interoperate with the gatekeeper's own services. This kind of depends on how they describe third parties. I mean, third party games already operate with PlayStation services, so maybe this rule would mostly apply to sideloaded services. For example, if PlayStation prevented you from backing up save files of sideloaded games to their cloud. So maybe that's the situation where this rule would apply, but I'm not entirely sure. Provide the company's advertising on their platform with access to the performance measure tools of the gatekeeper and the information necessary for advertisers and publishers to carry out their own independent verification of their advertisements hosted by the gatekeeper. I have no comment on this. I mean, I wish zero advertisements had access to my data, but that's just me. The other rules honestly don't interest me too much. Now, do I think the EU will ever target Sony in this regard? Honestly, I think right now they're more focused on the trillion-dollar tier of tech companies, and I kinda get why. Realistically, compared to the 6 gatekeepers, especially Alphabet, Microsoft, and Apple, Sony is not nearly as threatening as either of them. Even though they do have a lot of presence in really a lot of sectors of the tech and media world, and they've been around for a really long time, so they're a very persistent company. But in terms of how much market value they have, they're not even like not even a little bit close to the 6 gatekeepers, and because of that, they're probably gonna be off the radar for a while. But one thing I do hope is that the DMA starts to scare other tech companies enough that they will think twice before creating walled gardens. I think right now Sony doesn't really care, and they'll continue to push how much they can get away with whatever they're currently doing, but I do hope that in the future things do change. In the meantime, I'll continue buying weird games in the Japanese store. Take care.